To make sourdough bread, you need a sourdough starter. So in this video, I'm going to teach you how to make a sourdough starter with just 2 ingredients, rye flour and water. Included in this video is going to be a free sourdough starter guide. You can click the link down in the description to download the guide and follow along with me. Let's do it. Here's everything you'll need. A couple clean jars, a spatula, a spoon, some whole grain rye flour that you can just get at the grocery store, some room temperature water, and then a digital scale. If you don't have one, there's a link in the description to the one I recommend. All sourdough starter is a mixture of flour and water that you let sit out on your counter for a few days until it gets bubbly enough to make your bread rise. So on the first day, add 10 grams of water directly to your jar, then just zero out the scale, and add 10 grams of flour to the jar. Rye flour works amazing for this. We're just adding the same amount of flour and water by weight to the jar. That's why it's important to have a digital scale. Then just mix up your flour and water until there aren't any dry bits of flour left. And move your scale out of the way if it's really annoying you. Once your starter is all mixed together, go ahead and grab a rubber band so you can mark the top of the starter. This will be especially helpful in a few days when your starter starts growing between feedings. You'll want to be able to see how much it's grown overnight. Now just cover this up and let it sit on your counter for 24 hours. Day 2. By the second day, your starter should look basically the same as your starter did on the first day. It's just a clump of dough in a jar, basically. But because it's so warm and humid in Chicago right now, my starter is actually showing some signs of fermentation. See those CO2 bubbles there? That means the starter is beginning to ferment. You'll probably start to see those CO2 bubbles on day 2 or 3. I've pre-measured the ingredients today for my own convenience, but you're going to be feeding your starter the same thing as yesterday. 10 grams of rye flour and 10 grams of water. I usually start by adding the water first, but you can do whatever you want. Water, then flour, or flour then water. Then grab your spatula or spoon and stir the flour, water, and starter together until there aren't any dry bits of flour left. Then mark the top of the starter with the rubber band again. Cover this up and let it sit on your counter for 24 hours. By day 3, my starter began to show some signs of activity. It grew beyond the rubber band and it started to fall back down again. And there were still a lot of CO2 bubbles, even 24 hours after feeding. So since your starter is growing up, you're going to need to feed it more food. So on day 3, go ahead and feed it 20 grams of water and 20 grams of whole grain rye flour. Just what a growing starter needs. Then stir this up until there aren't any dry bits of flour left. You know what to do by now. Cover it up and let it sit out for another day. It's the evening, it is day 4, and my starter is unfortunately not showing much sign of activity. But I think this is actually pretty normal. When you're creating a sourdough starter from scratch, we're trying to cultivate wild yeast and bacteria just from flour and water. And this stuff takes time. So if your starter doesn't grow, doesn't double in size like you think it's supposed to, if it doesn't show much activity on a certain day, don't freak out, don't throw your starter away. It's not dead. Just keep feeding it flour and water, following the schedule that I'm giving you. Just keep feeding it like normal. It'll all be okay. For day 4, you're going to be feeding 40 grams of flour and 40 grams of water to your starter. This feeding is twice as much as the day before. And today's a little bit different because after you mix up your starter, do everything like you normally do, mark it with the rubber band, cover it up, and you're going to let it rest. But this time we're just waiting 12 hours until the next feeding. So instead of waiting a full day, you're going to feed this in 12 hours. I've been feeding mine at night, so that means tomorrow morning, day 5, I'm going to check the starter and feed it again. It's the morning of day 5 and my starter has officially doubled in size. This might happen for you on day 4 or day 6 or any other day. Every starter is kind of different. But just follow the feeding schedule that I lay out for you on the free sourdough starter guide. Again, there's a link to download that in the description. Because our starter is growing so much, we're going to go ahead and move 50 grams of the starter to a clean jar, and we're going to use that going forward. You can throw away or use the rest of the starter in a different recipe if you want to. But just move 50 grams of starter to a new jar, and then go ahead and feed that 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. This is called a 1-1-1 feeding because we're using equal parts of each ingredient, starter, flour, and water. So stir everything up, Then cover it and mark it with the rubber band, and you're going to let this sit out for just 12 hours. We'll feed it one more time today. So in the evening, we're going to feed the starter the same way we did in the morning. Get a new clean jar, put 50 grams of starter in the jar, 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water, and stir to combine everything until there aren't any dry bits of flour left. Then cover this up and let it sit for 12 more hours. The starter should be almost ready to use. On day 6, you're going to feed your starter the same way you did on day 5. Once in the morning and once at night. Instead of moving 50 grams of the starter to a different jar, I'm just going to scoop out half of this starter and throw it out. It's a little bit easier that way. Then feed the starter 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. Then seriously, just a few hours later, it's already growing so much. Crazy. One sign that tells you your starter is ready to bake bread is predictability. Right now my starter is getting a little bit more predictable each and every time I feed it. When I feed it, I'm looking for it to double in size in about 4 to 8 hours. Once it starts doing that every time I feed it, I'll know it's ready to go. Another interesting way to tell if your starter is ready to use is by the smell. And on the Sourdough Starter Guide, I actually go through day by day and tell you how I think your starter should smell. That's just another great bonus for downloading the free Sourdough Starter Guide. So go ahead and do it. So the feeding right now is the same as 12 hours before. Just get rid of half of your starter, mix in 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. Then adjust that rubber band so you know how much your starter grows. And then it's time for the starter's bedtime. And my bedtime. By day 7, my sourdough starter is absolutely ready to make sourdough bread. It rises and falls every time I feed it. It smells a little sour. It's just perfect. If your starter needs a few more days of feedings, that's totally fine. Just use the schedule that I lay out in the Sourdough Starter Guide. There are a bunch of different ways you can maintain your sourdough starter, but this is the way I do it. I just keep about a tablespoon of starter in a jar, covered up in the fridge. Then the night before I want to make bread, I just take the starter out of the fridge, feed it, and by the next morning it's bubbly and ready to use. And in case you're wondering, you can feed your starter any kind of flour you want at this point. All-purpose flour, bread flour, anything should work. Thanks for watching how to make a sourdough starter with rye flour. Make sure you hit the subscribe button because next week I'll be showing you how to make a no-knead sourdough bread with your new starter. Later guys.